Thank you again. I've got to live up to an introduction like that and got to be provocative. I don't know how provocative I'll be, but I do want to be contrarian and talk a little bit about legal scholarship in the past 20 years, legal scholarship going forward, and some of the motivations for a session such as this. Joan said we're here to deal with blurring boundaries, and of course, the two kinds of blurring boundaries we're talking about are subject matter, those of our own creation, commodities and insurance and securities and banking and all that, and the boundaries in law, once an autonomous legal discipline, no longer so, and thus all of our subjects can be attacked from angles that include all sorts of different methodologies. But even though she didn't point that out, I suspect it's self-evident that the motivation for a session like this is the global financial crisis. It's that, the last 5 years, or 6 years, or whatever it is now, that has crystallized our dissatisfaction with boundaries, that has proved to us that the boundaries didn't work. And I suspect we've all come away as scholars wanting and needing more. What did we learn from the financial crisis? Well, I suppose there are two main lessons. One is systemic risk is not limited to traditional banking institutions. The second is that markets can enable, not just discipline, risk-taking. Well, duh. Did we not really know that? Could we not go back 20 or 30 years in the scholarship and find warnings, scholars saying, pay attention? And the answer is, of course we can, but not enough of it. If you look back at the last 30 years of legal scholarship in the corporate financial area, whatever we want to call this, we as scholars exhibited an extraordinary amount of herd behavior. We wrote endless articles about independent directors. More articles about independent directors than anyone needed or could imagine. Poison pills, the market for corporate control. You could find long lists. What weren't we paying attention to? Well, my big candidate, and again, especially for the older people in the room, I'm not going to name names of the people I think did well to anticipate some of these things. You can all privately claim your own exceptionalism. I mean you, but I'm not going to mention you by name. But by and large, we missed the story of debt. In the late 1980s, we did see the emergence of junk bond financing, yes, and we paid attention to it, and we talked about debt as a disciplining mechanism. Free cash flow is harder to waste when you're paying a lot in principal and interest. But apart from a few factoids like that, the fact that our system of financial engineering throughout our economy was creating new kinds of debt instruments, creating new forms of leveraging of debt instruments, creating new sources of demand and thus supply, pretty much missed us. As a result, the leveraging of corporate America, the leveraging of America in its entirety, happened with far less scholarly attention from us than it should have. That's the motivation for a session like this, because we can all ask the obvious question: what are we missing now? What is it that we're hurting in the direction of, so that all of us are writing about X? but not about why. Now, we're all scholars and we're all entrepreneurs. So if I really had good answers to that question, I wouldn't tell you. I'd be home writing. But of course, at a session like this, we are here to share ideas, to talk to each other about possibilities. And so what I said to myself was, I'm going to raise in this speech, to be provocative perhaps, some things that I am thinking about that are driving my scholarship that I'm absolutely convinced I have only a glimmer of a possible answer to, that I think many of us deserve to be paying attention. Again, more attention than we in the Academy are currently giving these issues. So I'm going to give you three and talk about three ideas. They are in ascending order. The first is going to strike many of you as not new at all. It's something some of you are already writing about. It's something I'm writing about. Claire Hill's going to talk about it in a few minutes. But I'm convinced we're nowhere close to understanding this, and that we desperately need to understand it. And the short form description is the behavior of the buy side. We went through the financial crisis with a story about immense risk being taken on and spread throughout our financial system in very complex, Henry, and inscrutable ways. And that has led most of us who have written about this subject to write about the sell side. Why is it that the originators, from mortgage originators through the pipeline, through the investment banks, did what they did? What is it they did? Why did they do it? What do we have to change to make sure this doesn't happen again? We've noted the buy side. The buy side was buying a lot of this stuff. Why? Exactly what was going on individually, institutionally, organizationally in the places that were consuming all of this. Now, again, there is scholarship out there, Claire has certainly written about this, that addresses this. And we have stories. Is this an agency cost story? Is this a psychology story to tell? What's going on? Well, crystallize this for a second. With all that's been written about Goldman Sachs and its sale of complex derivative products, what happened at IKB, the German bank that happened to be the one that consumed the product? Itself is something of a middleman that led to that particular SEC enforcement action. What's going on? The behavior of the buy side is extraordinarily interesting and extraordinarily important. After all, most of us have most of our retirement money tied up in buy-side institutions. What explains the behavior of TIAA-CREF? I'll pose that one as a great research subject. But we could do Fidelity, we could do Vanguard, we can do any number of other institutions. I had a friend, former boss, who went into the mutual fund world and rose quite high at one of the big name institutions. One time he said, after a couple of years at that place, names will not be stated here, that working at X, at that level, was like sitting on the banks of a river of gold. Every day, far more money than you possibly imagine was just flowing in front of you. And the overwhelming sense you got is you could take the biggest bucket in the world, put it in the river, take the money out, and the river would be unchanged. It would be flowing just as before. There is that sense, a numbness to the money before you that characterized what it was like to be inside the institution. And that's what I think we don't yet understand. What is it like to be inside the institution, to be in that cultural world? Why do you buy what you buy in the morning? How do you settle up in the afternoon? What is your relationship with peers? What explains the social world, the cultural world, as well as the economic world of the buy side? Many years ago, a cultural anthropologist at the University of North Carolina, some of you know him, John Conley, wrote a really interesting book called Fortune and Folly. He actually spent time living with the natives, mutual fund managers, in a small, not terribly important mutual fund, and wrote about the lives of people. It was exceptionally illuminating. It would challenge any theoretical assumption that any of us would make about the behavior of the buy side. It's a different story. And I suspect if we lived in IKB, if we lived in Goldman Sachs, we would discover things about what drives behavior that our economic theory, our look at big data, and all the other tools and methodologies that we typically take on don't necessarily tell us. So if I were going to pick the next big interdisciplinary move in our field, I think it is cultural anthropology. Not surveys of people in organizations, but deeply living with them to learn about language and culture, about the institutionalism, the isomorphism that happens in places like TIAA Craft, IKB, Goldman Sachs, and any number of institutions. And of course, that's extraordinarily important. As a substantive discipline, we can look at institutional investors from any number of angles. They're in the business of insurance, in commodities, in securities, in banking. But have we paid attention to things like ERISA? How many of us in this room are aware of what's going on at the Department of Labor right now, where the Department of Labor is in the middle of its own fiduciarization effort that could radically change the legal structure for many billions, indeed trillions of dollars that sit in IRA retirement accounts. It's an extraordinary issue. It's one we're giving nearly no attention. And so I think much more, methodologically, substantively, could go into the buy side. And we'll have much to learn. Number two, now we ascend. And this is going to be a pet project of mine. So make it quite clear this is what fascinates me and motivates my own research agenda right now. It can be stated in one hyphenated word: hypercompetition. We are in a world, in an economy that is growing more competitive by the moment. We know that. Globalization, technology, all sorts of forces have and are driving institutions in the direction of a much more severe competition where the fear of failure and disappearance is very real. It is spilled over to the individual context. People, to succeed in institutions, to survive in institutions, themselves have to become hyper-competitive. As winners take most, if not all, the laggards lose. The question is, what does that do to human beings, to institutions, to organizations? Neoclassical economics is, of course, all about competition. We assume competitive markets in order to study behavior. But the simplifying assumptions of neoclassical economics don't begin to capture the reality of what happens when people are caught in hyper-competitive settings, when people perceive the opportunities that come out of hyper-competitive settings. From the world of psychology, cognitive neuroscience, sociology, there is a flood of work in the last 2 or 3 years on this subject. What does hyper-competition, the perception of extreme fear and extreme payoffs, do to risk-taking? Yesterday, I read an interesting article about golfers and how they take risks in tournaments when they're winning, when they're close to the gigantic payoff, when they're lagging behind. Personal relationships. What happens to people's relationships when competition is superimposed? Ethical judgment. We know that the mind processes moral judgment differently as competition frames the setting. One of my favorite books, I'm convinced it's a great book, but one of my favorite books of the last year is by J.M. Coates, who is a cognitive neuroscientist at Oxford, but previously a commodities trader, and talks about the brain under competition. What happens when you walk into the trading pits from moment one through the end of the day, through the end of the week, through the end of the month? What's happening in your brain? The book is called, and this is a great title, The Hour Between Dog and Wolf. The Hour Between Dog and Wolf. We like dogs. We know lots of dogs. We pet them. They're friendly. But dogs can show their teeth and under sustained conditions become wolf-like, if not wolves themselves. And that's his metaphor. That's what's going on in a trading room. And of course, he's talking not only of trading rooms, but investment banks. Subject area with, I'm fascinated by the question of who wins in life. As we become more competitive, as we move to a world that is more winner-take-all, who wins? We are very happy to celebrate winners or demonize winners. We need to understand winners, because winners are the CEOs, the members of the board of directors, the hedge fund managers, who are the subject of our scholarship. If we don't understand winners, we don't understand our field. And I have this strange sense that the more we come to understand winners, the more nervous we're going to get. Number 3, and this is the most speculative. This is my essay question that I haven't even begun to write an answer to, except I really like to think about it and go in circles. It's hard to read the papers over the last 2 years, or read whatever websites you want to look at, without encountering the palpable anxiety about the future of work. Are we possibly coming toward the end of a multi-century age of human capital, where most people had significant value? An economic enterprise and the legal support for economic enterprise was to organize the various forms of input into an enterprise, including this massive human capital, into a productive organization. Well, suppose technology is moving faster than we think in the direction of artificial intelligence, to be able to supplant most people as having significant economic value. Now, the debate, of course, as most all of you know, is between economists who say technology always creates new human resource opportunities, with those who are saying in the past it has, but maybe this time it's different. What if we are coming to the end of the age of human capital? What if? It strikes me that many of the enterprises that we study as subject matters, corporate law, securities law, financial institution law, have gained much of their legitimacy over the past 100 or 150 years because we knew that organizations did create jobs. Whatever we wanted to say about economic power and inequality of wealth, organizations hired people. The social legitimacy of capitalism, to some extent, depends on that insight. What if it starts fading? What if we are to imagine a world of corporate law, of securities law, of enterprise law, going forward, where there's a palpable disconnect, where more and more the perception is that corporateness or enterprise rewards capital, rewards technological innovation, but does not necessarily reward broad segments of the American population. Anybody who has spent time with the Jobs Act of 2012 sees this vividly. Changes made to our system of entrepreneurial and startup capital raising that very deliberately trade off elements of investor protection in order to create jobs. Now, if that works, if it does create jobs, we could have a nice argument about whether the trade-off was worth it. You can't rule out that some sacrifice of investor protection, some sacrificing of the gullible, might be justified on a utilitarian calculus by this. But many people are skeptical that that nexus really exists. If we've traded off investor protection for what essentially will be a movement of capital into the hands of entrepreneurs that creates wealth for entrepreneurs but doesn't generate jobs, I think we're going to be looking at this subject very differently going forward. So that's a perfect example of, wait a minute, for 150 years we've been making an assumption about business enterprises that may be weakening. So what does that do to our field? This last subject could be attacked from any number of directions. I think another one of our big subject areas for the next few years is going to be the relationship between us, legal scholars in the field of enterprise organization, and our colleagues who do intellectual property, who do employment law, who are interested in the other inputs that are relevant to what organizations produce. And there's a lot that's going to be exciting about those kinds of collaborations. I'm fascinated by Ron Gilson and his work on contracting for innovation. I think that's a nice example of a nexus that a lot of us could follow in with. But I keep my question in the background. What if the social perception is of a disconnect between capital and employment? What is that going to do to the underpinnings of everything we think about? So those are my three subject areas. I think each one of them deserves a lot more attention than we're giving them. I think they are rich subject areas. And especially the last tempts us to do something we should always be doing. Of course, our task as corporate security scholars is to understand. We are social scientists. We must understand. We must comprehend. But I think as we step back and look at the financial crisis, we look at the future of jobs, we realize that we're not far from the justice business either. But a lot of what we ought to think about is not just description, but gets us deeply into the legitimacy of the areas we're studying, and thus connects to issues of justice as well as social science type understanding. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you.